I work now, and with even a couple people that are joining this webinar tonight, this morning for some of us and stuff. But yeah, I work now full time in Bible storing. Do a lot of different things, but most of it is about helping locals develop stories into their own languages, and then training them and helping them to use them in church planting strategies and evangelism, discipleship, small groups, and church planting and multiplying churches and things like that. And a lot of, where I kind of fell into some of this stuff really began with Tibet. Like you said, I lived in Tibet 14 years, and I've since then I've done various things still with Tibetans, but back in the States now with my family. And when we began working with Tibetans, um, my team leader at the time, he had just made this radical shift to using chronological Bible stories. It was back in like 2005 kind of thing, and it was starting to, I think, catch some head steam with one story and things like that. But this was pretty radical at the time for us and for Tibetan work, and basically it just kind of came out of just the reality of like who were Tibetans. Tibetans were so illiterate that it was going to be difficult to reach them, or reach many of them using more written methods and stuff. So they have like a 70% illiteracy rate, probably. Probably about 80% functionally illiterate rate, which basically means like, some people can read, but they generally don't. And so like trying to use written methods would be really difficult with them. So that was kind of like in our hearts, like that was kind of the brutal fact of like, this is who they were. And so we need to do something else and stuff. If we're going to reach them, and it's going to have to be more than just using the written Bible or written materials or written language or all these kind of things like that. We kind of described it as it was kind of like an American, I'll say American football field of like 100 yards, uh, and we were only with having the Bible and having written methods, we were only getting to like the 20-yard line, is what it was like, and we were not getting everybody access to the Word of God and things. And so we started using Bible stories. So it began with like developing Bible stories, and that was the goal. We're going to start sharing Bible stories. We're going to start helping others share Bible stories. And what we began to discover uh, was this was not so much about literacy as we thought it was. It went far, far beyond literacy. And I think for like a lot of people, that's probably where it starts. Is like, how are we going to reach these people? They can't read. And so like, that's where we began too. But what we discovered was as people started taking these stories and then testing them with their friends and people they knew and stuff, it was like this whole world of oral peoples and oral preference learners. Just this whole world just opened up to us that we had no idea about, and we started discovering all kinds of things. And with that, we started also seeing a new level of understanding among Tibetans than we had previously had in our regular evangelistic methods. And so, like, what did we encounter? What did we learn? What did we see and stuff? There are probably three things that I'll kind of sit in for a little while of how we saw Bible storing be effective. But to kind of do that, I think I need to set it up with these were the struggles that we were having that were very common among Tibetan workers and reaching Tibetan Buddhists. And I think a lot of these will you'll probably be able to connect with in some of the work you're doing. One of the struggles that we had was we were having difficulty explaining biblical concepts to people. We were trying to explain biblical concepts, biblical doctrines, and like, God is like this and God is like that. Well, as I'm sure a lot of you guys encounter with working with Buddhists, is that they don't really have a word for just the one high God, supreme God at all. So we had to like, I mean, I say we, like a couple hundred years ago, translators chose a word that was not commonly used at all for this concept of the biblical God and things. It comes from the word for like the three precious jewels, which I think they have in other Buddhist circles, of like the Dharma, the Buddha, the Dharma, and then like the monastic system. I forgot what that's called, but it's yeah. Thanks, Joe. So um, so we were trying to explain like this word concho, that was Konchak was the word for God. And like so Konchak is, we were trying to explain it like, oh, he's like this and he's like that, and he's good and he's powerful, and and it's like these abstract ideas to a concept that they have no idea about, that they're trying to just wrap their heads around, and they're having trouble doing it. And so we always had difficulty in explaining all kinds of concepts, the term for God being one of them. um, Another thing problem we were having was that, and if you've ever had this, if you've ever had this same thing, I want you to raise your hand too. Every person that had ever shared with a Tibetan had heard them say back to them, "Oh, that's just like what we believe." Has
Oh,
anybody ever had that? Anybody ever shared with a Buddhist and they
yes.
go, "Oh, that's what I believe." Yeah,
Mhm.
we're going, "Oh my goodness, that is the opposite of what you believe. How are you getting Buddhism from what I'm saying about Jesus and stuff?" And it was so hard for them to filter in what I was saying through their mental framework that they have. You following me? They
Mhm.
were, their worldview was so different that they would hear compassion, or they would hear Jesus loves me, or Jesus is powerful, and they would just filter that into their Buddhist worldview and framework, and they would assume it was the same thing and stuff. And so then it leads to more explanation, which explaining things just was just so difficult and just rarely helped. It felt like a lot of times. And then eventually, I can remember sitting in a tea house uh, and just so frustrated with somebody, I just started like just arguing with them, kind of thing, and that just made it worse. It didn't help at all. Just that I'm trying to like explain it. It's so frustrated that you think this way, that I'm just going to argue with you and make sure you get this is not the same. Buddhism bad, Jesus good. And that didn't go so well. So all these things were leading to the obvious kind of like conclusion that we just had difficulty presenting the gospel clearly. How are we? How are we gonna? They can't understand these concepts and terms and all these things. How are we going to explain the full gospel in a way that they can get it and stuff? Well, when we started using Bible stories, things changed for us. Um, we started seeing every single one of these struggles being overcome. And again, we started with they can't read, so we're going to use something that they can understand. Access was the issue for us, and it became way deeper and way more helpful than we ever imagined. When it came to like these terms and doctrines that they weren't getting, like God, Konchok, and all this stuff, all of a sudden they were getting it, and we didn't have to struggle to communicate anymore. Um, it was literally the stories were doing all the heavy lifting for us. And the reason why is because you could tell somebody God's powerful and God's compassionate, and these ideas out here that just aren't tangible and relatable and stuff. But when you shared a story about the paralytic man, and Jesus had come, and he sees the friends, he sees this guy, he heals them, he forgives his sins, and all of a sudden these concepts that are out there, now they're relatable, now they're tangible. And while we were trying to explain things, it was just kind of like stuff would just kind of just slide off of them. It kind of felt like, you're trying to tell them God loves you, and it would just slide off. And they, like, yeah, I kind of get that, but I don't understand really what that means.
I didn't know
But
how to do it on this.
when they would, but when we would share that kind of story like that, it was like it would just stick to them. They would get it,
I'm
and they would go,
also
"Oh yeah." that makes sense. I understand what you're talking about, because
Windows
it wasn't
Windows
abstract
key.
anymore. I don't know. Somebody's I think on talking and stuff, but yeah. Um. Anyways, yeah. So it just became tangible for them, and that's what I mean. If you guys have been historian very long and stuff, oral preference learners are
Huh.
concrete thinkers. They learn concretely, and the abstract ideas, the 3-point sermons, the four spiritual laws, all these great tools that we've had and
Does
used for
this
so
have
many
to go
years, they
with the
don't.
sermon song?
Yeah,
Part
somebody's
one,
still
sermon steps.
not on mute.
Yes, we can do this on the computer. I saw
Yeah.
T.
Be sure to go ahead and mute your
Charlene and
stuff.
Steve.
All right. Good deal. All right. Good. I'll keep going. Yeah. So just oral preference learners are concrete thinkers, and presenting concrete information is helpful. And here's what that means, actually. I mean, so what does that even? I mean, what is concrete information? I mean, Jesus is God. Jesus is good. I mean, how could it be less concrete than that? But what they need is they need to be able to touch it. They need to be able to relate to it, and then it like goes, oh, I get that from my life. For example, I shared I was in the Seoul airport on Monday afternoon, and I meet this Japanese mom and daughter, and I end up having a conversation with them. I end up sharing the story of the demoniac with them, and I asked them, so what did you like in the story? And the mom says, not the answer I was expecting, but she said, I like that the man did not have any hope, but God gave him hope. And so I was like, whoa, okay, that's an interesting answer. So I asked her, I said, do you have hope? And she said, no, not at all. And for her, it was where she was at personally. And she hears a story about a demon possessed man, which, sounds kind of far maybe from her life in some ways, but she saw in that man, he was going nowhere. And she felt, because that's how she felt like. And it became like, it wasn't me saying, hey, Jesus can give you hope. That wouldn't stick with her. But she saw it, she tasted it, she related to it. And now she's walking away going, I want to know more about Jesus giving me hope too and stuff. And that's what happened, what we saw so much with the Tibetans. Um, one of the interesting patterns we began to see was that by the third or fourth story, they understood what God was. We weren't explaining things to them. We weren't arguing with them. We weren't going through a 3-point series or whatever. We were telling simple stories with simple questions. That was it. What'd you like? What'd you learn about God? What'd you learn about man? We were not doing much at all. Again, it was the stories were doing all the heavy lifting. And when we began to see these patterns by the third or fourth story, they knew what God was. They had built a theology from simply like creation, fall of man, maybe the birth of Jesus, or some other story or whatnot. But they were getting it and stuff, and they were building that kind of just framework again, that mental framework. They were getting it through simple stories, and we weren't having to do very much at all, just explaining things. But what we also started seeing, so what I asked you guys if you had ever had anybody say this is just like Buddhism, and I know so many of you guys raise your hand. Here's what we also started discovering. Here was another pattern. By the third or fourth story, people understood this was not Buddhism at all. Again, we're not trying to prove anything at all. We're talking creation, maybe the demoniac, fall of man, birth of Jesus, something like that. By the third, hearing 3 or 4 of those stories, they were going, oh, this is not like Buddhism at all. This is totally different. And it was like this amazing victory that we were seeing happen because the stories were doing all the heavy lifting. And one of the patterns that we started seeing is that we were going out in the villages and sharing with a lot of people and stuff. And we started recognizing by the third or fourth story, many of these people are saying, no, we're not interested anymore. And we started putting two and two together and going, oh, they're understanding what this is not what we believe and stuff. And so the people that would stick around and say, yeah, we do want to keep hearing more, they understood this is not Buddhism and we have to have more. We got to hear more stories. We got to know more about Jesus. And as a result of those things, there was a clear understanding of Jesus, a clear understanding of the gospel. And that's what our desires and goals are. One of our goals that we all should have is a clear presentation of the gospel. You talk about how you share or what you share, what not. Declaring things clearly is important. Them understanding is important and stuff. And we started seeing a lot more understanding just by simply using the stories and stuff. And it wasn't earth-shattering stuff. It was so simple and easy that anybody could do it, and they could do it, and they could tell others and stuff like that. It just it was so it was so relatable. It was so understandable for them and stuff. Are you tracking with me? Are you start? I mean, you're kind of starting to imagine stuff in your own work and things. Um, I want to kind of just give you guys a little bit of ideas of like, so what did you share? Like, what stories did you share? Like, what was your story set? Did you have like a really good Buddhist story set and stuff? Um, so when we started out, we sat down, this group, a couple locals, couple of workers, and like, all right, let's get some good stories. What's going to be really good? Let's have a good theme and stuff like that. Um, and when it all got said and done, nobody would ever be able to tell that this was for Tibetans. It was like so many stories that are used across all kinds of people groups and stuff, that you just you had fall of man, creation. We had a couple other Old Testament stories we felt that were necessary. We had birth of Jesus, paralytic, the demoniac, and a couple other just miracle stories, and the crucifixion, resurrection. It's about like 10, 12 stories really. And I'll put this in the chat. But we've recently developed an app in English called creationtochrist.app that just has all these stories that anybody can use in their work and stuff. And again, it was like, this is Buddhist. It really didn't feel like it and stuff. But here's what we were seeing. What were their values? What were their like? What was their like? What did they think their problems were? You know what I mean? Like, what do they perceive as their problems in life? And like, what are their barriers to coming to Christ? And we started seeing the stories hit all of these. And so when it came to like values and stuff, like we're talking like, we thought we understood some stuff. We didn't understand anything. When we started using stories and testing stories and just telling people, we figured out like who they were and stuff. Their two greatest values that we discovered were compassion and power. And I think you could say that like, does other Buddhist groups, do they say compassion more than they say love? It feels like it's a very Buddhist thing to kind of say and stuff. But when we would share, like, for example, we share the demoniac and we go, what'd you learn about Jesus? Oh, he's compassionate. He's very powerful. I was like, oh, okay. I share the paralytic story. What'd you learn? What'd you like about Jesus? Oh, he was compassionate and he was powerful. And they kept saying the same thing over and over again. And we started discovering, oh, this is what they value. This is what's important to them. And these stories were expressing those values to them. And so it was a good thing that they were connecting with those stories in that way. And when it came to their problems that they have, like perceived problems, sin and suffering, I mean, that's just basic karma, Buddhist, you know, uh, ideas and stuff, that we have suffering in this world because we got sin in our lives and we keep doing bad things and we keep going through these cycles and stuff like that. And so we would kind of like add a couple things in, maybe amplify a couple things. So when it, like, for example, like in the creation story, we would make sure we were being a little explicit at times when it came to these concepts of sin and stuff. And so like in the creation, we would kind of at the end would say, God looked around and he looked at everything and it was perfect. And then we would amplify that biblically accurate, that there was no sin and there was no suffering. And then in the fall of man story, it would end it with, and from then on, there was sin and there was suffering in the world. And so we would kind of throw those things in there, and then I would emphasize, hey, yeah, in the Jesus stories, yeah, man, he cleanses sins. And I don't know about you guys, but in Tibetan, it's unnatural to say you're saved from sins. You say you're cleansed from sins and you're saved from suffering. That's natural to say. Saved from sins isn't very natural, at least with Tibetans. And that might be I think that's a Buddhist concept that something you might want to think about, and just uh, you know maybe just saying cleanse sins is maybe even more natural for them to hear and stuff. Um, uh, Barriers, and I'll close with this here. Biggest barriers: idolatry and persecution. I mean, it's kind of the exclusivity of Jesus Christ is a barrier. Uh, and we're not going to get past that barrier. We're not going to, that's not going to be something we're going to water down at all. But I remember sharing this one family. We got through all the stories, and we had not done anything super explicit uh, with like idolatry. We've thrown it in there. We've kind of subtly kind of and they were rejecting God and doing whatever they wanted, and even starting to worship other gods and idols. We would kind of subtly throw that in there. But at the end, I went back and we told the Elijah story. And what was so great about that story was it was not confrontational. I mean, the message of that story is confrontational in some ways, of like, idolatry isn't good. God's more powerful than all other gods. But here's what they heard. They heard it was like this indirect way of kind of going around and hitting it, instead of going right at him and saying, you need to repent, your idolatry is bad. It was going around and was saying, oh, they enjoyed the story. It's super interesting, right? And they would go, oh yeah, those people, yeah, their gods, they were worshiping their gods, and yeah, they should have worshiped God. It was totally right that they should worship God. But at the same time, they know that they're indirectly talking about themselves as well. And that, oh, yeah, this is us. And so we could take that next step of talking about that, and things. And so we just, again, the stories were doing the heavy lifting. We didn't have to like try to make sure we got that point in. Or we were so direct that it was almost confrontational and uncomfortable, or things like that. The stories were doing the heavy lifting. Um, and when it came to persecution, do you know what story we used? The John 9 blind man story. You remember that story? A lot of people started. I have a friend that works with Vietnamese now. He started using that as like his intro story, because of the karma aspect of like, who sinned? This man, who sinned? Did his parents sin, or did he sin? No, it was to show the glory of God. And the man gets healed. His family rejects him. His parents reject him. His community rejects him. The religious community rejects him, and he still follows Jesus. And you ask these Tibetans, what did you like about the story? I like that he stood up. Persecution being a huge barrier, what's keeping them from going from following Buddhism and repenting and following Jesus? And their answer is, I liked that he still believed in Jesus while they're struggling with that concept themselves. Again, indirectly coming at them, and it's relatable, and they get it and stuff. And it just, when we started using stories, it just opened things up for us. We didn't understand what oral preference learners was. We didn't really know, didn't care. We were just trying to let people understand Jesus. Um, and it just so many things that were struggles for us, they were overcoming and stuff because the stories were just so powerful in and of themselves. It's a way that is concrete, relatable, that is how oral preference learners think and learn and stuff. Um, and I was just literally in Southeast Asia with several workers working with Buddhists and several locals that came from Buddhist backgrounds and stuff. It was just a Buddhist meeting and talking to them about probably half of them are using Bible stories in their ministries and seeing, and I'm not exaggerating, um, they're seeing hundreds of churches being planted right now, using a lot of church planting methods, multiplication methods, and making sure that they're using Bible stories in it because it's doing all the heavy lifting and it's powerful among them.